I sat at my desk while aircraft failed to return and my tables still balanced. My superiors trusted the numbers, but not what they left out. Each loss appeared as an absence, and the system treated it as silence. I realized the figures were correct, and the conclusions were not. In the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced an operational problem that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. From airfields in eastern England, American heavy bombers were flying deep into occupied Europe on daylight missions. The intent was precise industrial disruption. Ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, rail yards, and oil facilities. The operational doctrine was clear and formally approved. Tight bomber formations, overlapping defensive fire, and carefully planned routes would allow unescorted aircraft to penetrate enemy airspace and return with acceptable losses. The reality, recorded in mission summaries and maintenance logs, was less orderly. By mid-1943, aircraft were returning to bases in Norfolk and Suffolk with visible damage that did not always align with expected patterns. Some formations lost aircraft despite flying as prescribed. Others completed missions with unexpectedly low damage despite heavy fighter contact. Loss rates varied sharply between similar operations. Reports accumulated, but they were fragmented, dispersed across after-action summaries, engineering notes, and crew debriefs. At Wright Field, Ohio, the Army Air Force's primary center for aeronautical research and operational analysis, these reports were compiled, tabulated, and filed. The work was not glamorous. It involved forms, columns of numbers, and long hours with mechanical calculators that clicked and whirred with each rotation of their handles. Among the civilian analysts assigned to this work was a woman in her early 30s. She was not a pilot, engineer, or officer. Her role was officially clerical and analytical, compiling operational data, checking calculations, and preparing statistical summaries for review by officers and engineers. She held a degree in mathematics, one of a small number of women hired during the war to fill technical roles vacated by men sent overseas. Her workspace was a shared office with steel desks arranged in rows. The windows looked out over runways and hangars where test aircraft taxied past at regular intervals. On her desk sat a Marchant mechanical calculator, a stack of mission damage reports, and several bound ledgers labeled by month and theater. Each morning she followed a routine. She logged incoming reports, verified figures against original field submissions, and recalculated totals where inconsistencies appeared. Damage locations were coded numerically: wings, fuselage, engines, control surfaces. Losses were recorded separately, with causes categorized as fighter attack, flak, mechanical failure, or unknown. The work demanded precision rather than interpretation. Her task, as defined by procedure, was to ensure that numbers were accurate before they were forwarded upward. Analysis beyond that level was the responsibility of officers and specialized boards. Over time, however, patterns began to surface, not as conclusions but as irregularities that resisted easy explanation. One recurring feature was the uneven distribution of damage across returning aircraft. Certain sections showed heavy concentrations of hits, while others appeared almost untouched. This alone was not surprising. Bomber formations presented particular profiles to enemy fighters, and German defenses were known to focus on engines and cockpits. What was less expected was how these distributions shifted between missions that, on paper, were nearly identical. Two raids flown at similar altitudes against comparable targets with similar escort coverage could produce markedly different results in terms of survivability. Another issue involved aircraft that failed to return. Loss reports listed them, but by definition, no damage diagrams accompanied those entries. The absence was procedural rather than deliberate. There was simply no physical airframe to inspect. As weeks passed, the woman found herself recalculating certain tables more than once. Official summaries averaged damage across all returning aircraft, and losses were reported separately. The figures balanced mathematically, but the totals did not always align with the operational outcomes described in mission narratives. She made no formal note of this at first. The system was not designed for individual reinterpretation. Her responsibility ended with verified arithmetic. In August 1943, a series of daylight raids intensified concerns at higher levels. Missions against heavily defended industrial targets resulted in loss rates that strained replacement schedules. Commanders requested clearer guidance on aircraft vulnerability and potential improvements in defensive configuration. As a response, Wright Field increased its analytical output. More data was requested from the European theater. Damage reports became more detailed. Analysts were instructed to prepare refined tables showing hit frequency by aircraft section. The woman was assigned additional calculations. Her days lengthened. She recalculated damage frequencies using different grouping methods, strictly adhering to instructions, but noting how the results shifted depending on how losses were included or excluded. One afternoon, while cross-checking figures from two separate missions, she observed that a particular section of the aircraft, one previously assumed to be relatively resilient, showed low damage among survivors, but corresponded with a higher proportion of total losses. The relationship was not explicit in the official tables because losses were not broken down by damage location. The observation did not contradict any existing report, but it sat uncomfortably alongside them. She did not raise the issue immediately. Analysts of her rank were not expected to interpret operational doctrine. Moreover, the distinction between observed damage and inferred vulnerability was subtle and easy to misstate. The war environment did not encourage speculative conclusions unsupported by established methodology. Instead, she continued her assigned work. Over the following weeks, she quietly adjusted how she checked figures, comparing subsets of missions and recalculating averages with losses included in different ways. The mechanical calculator recorded every operation impartially, its metal keys worn smooth from constant use. The results were consistent in one limited sense. When only surviving aircraft were considered, certain areas appeared to absorb more damage. When losses were factored into the totals differently, those same areas no longer appeared dominant. This discrepancy pointed not to an error in arithmetic, but to a limitation in how the data was being summarized. At the institutional level, the Army Air Forces continued to rely on established assumptions. Bomber survivability was understood primarily through the lens of formation defense and incremental technical improvements. Armor additions and gun placements were debated within committees that balanced protection against weight and performance. The analytical apparatus at Wright Field supported these debates by providing quantitative summaries. Those summaries, however, reflected the structure of the data as collected, not necessarily the full operational picture. By early September 1943, the woman had compiled several internal worksheets, unofficial and not circulated, that illustrated how conclusions changed depending on whether non-returning aircraft were treated as missing data or as a distinct category requiring integration. She did not attach interpretations to these worksheets. They existed as numerical exercises consistent with her role. Still, the act of creating them marked a departure from routine verification towards something closer to analytical questioning. The broader operational situation remained unresolved. Losses continued. Commanders pressed for answers. Engineering teams explored incremental modifications, often constrained by production realities. Within the confines of her office, the woman continued to calculate, tabulate, and check. The figures added correctly, the summaries met their specifications, yet the underlying problem, the gap between recorded damage and actual survivability, remained present, though not yet formally acknowledged. At this stage, nothing had changed in procedure or doctrine. No recommendations had been issued. No meetings had been convened around her worksheets. The system functioned as designed, processing vast quantities of data into orderly reports. The limits of that system were becoming visible only through quiet, repetitive calculation. By the early autumn of 1943, the operational tempo of the daylight bombing campaign increased rather than diminished. Missions were flown with greater frequency, and targets were selected deeper within German-controlled territory. The intent was to maintain pressure on industrial capacity while preparations for future ground operations continued elsewhere. The accumulation of data at Wright Field reflected this escalation. Mission reports arrived daily, sometimes in batches, carrying updated figures on aircraft losses, crew casualties, and damage assessments. The analytical workload expanded accordingly. Tables that once covered weeks now summarized days. Revisions were frequent as late reports arrived from the field. The woman remained assigned to damage analysis. Her responsibilities expanded modestly in scope, but not in authority. She now worked with a small group of civilian analysts and junior officers tasked with preparing consolidated summaries for senior review. The structure of the work remained hierarchical. Raw data was compiled, checked, and forwarded. Interpretive conclusions were left to designated committees. The discrepancies she had noticed earlier became more pronounced as the dataset grew. The statistical summaries increasingly relied on averages derived solely from aircraft that returned. Losses were tallied separately, often as simple counts or percentages per mission. This separation was procedurally logical. Damage assessments required physical inspection. Losses, lacking wreckage, could not be diagrammed in the same way. Yet the analytical consequence of this division was rarely examined. Repeated recalculations confirmed the same pattern. Aircraft sections that showed heavy damage among survivors were often those that could tolerate hits and still return. Conversely, sections that appeared relatively untouched in damage diagrams corresponded, in aggregate, to missions with higher loss rates. These observations remained confined to working papers. Official reports continued to present conclusions consistent with existing doctrine. Survivability improvements should focus on reinforcing areas that showed the highest frequency of damage on returning aircraft. On the operational level, this logic translated into proposals for additional armor around areas that already exhibited visible damage. The reasoning was straightforward. If a section was frequently hit, it must be vulnerable. Protecting it should reduce losses. Engineering teams evaluated these proposals with caution. Additional armor increased weight and reduced range or payload. Trade-offs were debated, but the underlying assumption about where protection was needed went largely unchallenged. Meanwhile, the bombing campaign experienced several costly missions. Losses over heavily defended targets raised concerns within the Army Air Force's leadership. Publicly, confidence in daylight precision bombing remained firm. Internally, pressure mounted to identify improvements that could be implemented without disrupting production schedules. Wright Field was asked to accelerate its analytical output. More refined breakdowns of damage frequency were requested. The woman and her colleagues responded by producing increasingly detailed tables, subdividing aircraft sections and categorizing hits by caliber and location. The added detail did not resolve the core issue, it sharpened it. In one series of summaries, damage to outer wing panels appeared disproportionately high. This result was interpreted as evidence that those areas required reinforcement. Yet when the woman compared missions with similar damage patterns but differing loss rates, the correlation weakened. The issue was not statistical noise, it was structural. The dataset inherently excluded the most severely damaged aircraft, those that failed to return, from certain analyses. This exclusion was not concealed, it was implicit. The analytical framework treated survivability and damage as related but distinct categories. As losses accumulated, questions arose within some analytical circles about the adequacy of existing methods. These questions were not yet formalized. They appeared in marginal notes, informal discussions, and requests for clarification rather than in official memoranda. The woman's position limited her participation in such discussions. She was not invited to meetings where doctrinal assumptions were debated. Her role remained that of a technical contributor, responsible for ensuring numerical accuracy. Nevertheless, her calculations increasingly diverged from the conclusions drawn from them. The divergence was subtle and required careful explanation. It was easier to overlook than to address. In late October, a revised directive arrived requesting an assessment of potential armor placement strategies based on existing damage data. The request specified that recommendations should be grounded in observed damage frequencies. The woman assisted in preparing the supporting tables. She followed the directive precisely, producing summaries that highlighted the most frequently damaged sections among returning aircraft. These tables aligned with earlier reports. Separately, she recalculated the same data using an alternative approach. She treated losses not as separate counts, but as an implicit indicator of vulnerability. Where data was missing, she noted the absence rather than excluding it. The results differed. Sections previously considered low risk no longer appeared so when losses were considered conceptually alongside damage. She did not label these results as recommendations. She presented them as an internal check, consistent with her role as an analyst verifying the robustness of calculations. When she shared the alternative tables with a senior civilian analyst in her section, the response was cautious. The figures were correct, but their interpretation was uncertain. Integrating losses into damage analysis required assumptions that were not explicitly sanctioned. The senior analyst acknowledged the discrepancy, but advised restraint. The established methodology had been approved at higher levels. Deviations, even mathematically sound ones, risked confusion or rejection. This response reflected institutional inertia rather than dismissal. The system favored consistency and repeatability over methodological experimentation, especially during ongoing operations. As November approached, mission losses remained a concern. While escort coverage incrementally improved, particularly at longer ranges, attrition continued to challenge planning assumptions. Replacement aircraft and crews could sustain losses only up to a point. Within Wright Field, the accumulation of data created an opportunity for deeper analysis. Whether that opportunity would be taken depended on whether existing assumptions were questioned. The woman continued her work. Her days followed the same routine, but the meaning she derived from the figures changed. She no longer saw the tables as neutral summaries. They reflected choices about what to include and what to omit. Her calculations did not contradict official conclusions outright. They suggested that the conclusions were incomplete. At this stage, no formal challenge had been raised. The alternative approach remained unofficial, confined to personal worksheets and cautious conversations. The operational problem persisted, and the analytical framework continued to function within its established boundaries. The gap between recorded damage and actual survivability widened, not because data was lacking, but because interpretation lagged behind accumulation. By December 1943, the analytical environment at Wright Field had shifted in subtle but important ways. Losses from the autumn campaign had prompted a broader review of bomber survivability, and several departments were asked to reassess their assumptions. The request was not framed as a critique of doctrine, but as a routine evaluation prompted by new operational data. Within this context, the woman's unofficial calculations gained relevance. They addressed a question that had not yet been formally articulated: whether damage observed on surviving aircraft could reliably indicate where additional protection would reduce losses. The turning point was not a meeting or a directive, but a practical necessity. A senior officer overseeing one of the survivability review panels requested clarification on why recent damage frequency tables did not appear to correlate with loss trends. The question was routed through analytical channels and reached the civilian section responsible for compiling the tables. The senior civilian analyst, aware of the alternative worksheets, asked the woman to prepare a supplemental set of calculations. The instruction was careful and limited. She was to show how damage distributions changed when losses were considered conceptually alongside surviving aircraft, without drawing conclusions or recommendations. This task carried risk, though it was not described as such. Presenting an alternative analytical framing could be interpreted as challenging established methodology. However, the request came from within the analytical chain, providing procedural cover. She worked methodically. Using existing mission data, she recalculated averages and distributions, explicitly noting where data was absent due to aircraft losses. Rather than attempting to infer damage patterns for lost aircraft, she treated their absence as informative in itself. The mechanical calculator recorded each operation, its steady rhythm marking hours of concentrated work. She checked each table repeatedly, ensuring internal consistency. The figures were not dramatic. They did not reverse conclusions entirely. They shifted emphasis. When the supplemental tables were complete, they were reviewed by the senior analyst and then forwarded to the panel with a brief explanatory note. The note avoided interpretive language. It described the method, the assumptions, and the resulting distributions. The panel's reaction was reserved. The tables did not fit neatly within existing frameworks, but they addressed a question the panel had struggled to answer. Why did reinforcing heavily damaged areas not produce the expected reduction in losses? Discussion followed, measured and technical. Some members questioned whether absence of data could be treated as meaningful. Others noted that excluding losses from damage analysis implicitly assumed that surviving aircraft were representative of all aircraft. The woman was not present for these discussions. Her role ended with the submission of accurate calculations. Nevertheless, the method she had applied became the subject of debate. The unofficial nature of the analysis was gradually formalized. The panel requested a more detailed explanation of the approach and its limitations. The senior analyst prepared the response, incorporating the woman's methodological notes. The concept at issue was not new in abstract terms, but it had not been operationalized within the Army Air Force's analytical process. The idea that survivorship bias could distort conclusions was known in academic circles, but it had not been systematically addressed in wartime damage analysis. As the discussion progressed, the implications became clearer. If heavily damaged sections on returning aircraft were, by definition, areas that could withstand damage, then reinforcing them might yield diminishing returns. Conversely, sections with little observed damage might represent vulnerabilities that led to losses before aircraft could return. This reframing did not invalidate existing data, it changed how the data was interpreted. The panel did not immediately endorse changes to armor placement. Instead, it requested further analysis, including sensitivity checks and comparisons across different mission profiles. The woman was assigned additional calculations under the supervision of the senior analyst. The workload increased, and with it scrutiny. Each table was examined for assumptions and potential misinterpretation. The analytical environment became more cautious, not less. At this stage, the risk became personal in a limited but real sense. While her work remained technical, its implications reached beyond routine verification. Errors or misstatements could undermine confidence in the approach and reflect on those involved. She responded by narrowing her focus further. No conclusions were attached to her tables. No recommendations were implied. The work remained descriptive, showing how distributions changed under different assumptions. The results continued to support the same underlying observation. The apparent vulnerability of certain aircraft sections depended heavily on whether losses were treated as separate or integrated into the analytical frame. As winter progressed, the panel's review intersected with practical constraints. Any changes to aircraft configuration had to be justified against production schedules and performance impacts. The analytical question thus acquired operational weight. By February 1944, the panel acknowledged that existing damage-based recommendations might be incomplete. This acknowledgement did not constitute a doctrinal shift, but it opened space for reconsideration. Within Wright Field, the woman's role remained unchanged in title and status. She was still a civilian analyst, one of many, working long hours with calculators and ledgers. Yet the method she had applied, quietly and without attribution, had entered formal review. The risk now lay not in presenting the analysis, but in how it would be received and acted upon. The data did not compel a single course of action. It required judgment. At this point, no decision had been made. The analytical process continued, balancing new insights against established practice. The bombing campaign itself continued, losses and successes recorded in parallel. The moment marked a shift from routine calculation to consequential analysis, achieved not through authority or advocacy, but through disciplined attention to what the data could and could not show. By early spring 1944, the analytical review of bomber survivability had reached a point where inaction itself carried consequences. The daylight bombing campaign was no longer an isolated effort. It was now directly tied to preparations for the invasion of Western Europe. Aircraft availability, crew survival, and mission effectiveness were operational priorities rather than abstract concerns. Within this context, the survivability panel at Wright Field was asked to provide clearer guidance. Engineering units needed direction that could be translated into production changes. Field commanders wanted assurance that adjustments were grounded in evidence rather than conjecture. The analytical work that had begun as a quiet methodological reconsideration now faced institutional pressure. The revised tables, those that incorporated the conceptual weight of losses, circulated more widely among analysts and engineers. Their implications were discussed cautiously. No one framed the issue as a repudiation of earlier doctrine. Instead, it was described as a refinement prompted by expanded data. Still, resistance emerged. Some officers argued that treating missing aircraft as analytical signals risked introducing speculation. Without physical evidence, they maintained, conclusions about where lost aircraft had been hit remained uncertain. Others noted that production constraints limited how much armor could be added, regardless of analytical insight. These objections were not dismissive. They reflected legitimate concerns within a system designed to privilege verifiable evidence and repeatable methods. The tension lay between methodological rigor and operational necessity. The existing framework was methodologically clean, but operationally incomplete. The revised approach was analytically suggestive but relied on inference. The woman was not present in the meetings where these tensions played out. Her calculations, however, were central to the discussion. Requests for clarification and recalculation continued to reach her section. Each request required careful handling. Any inconsistency could weaken confidence in the entire approach. She responded by producing additional sensitivity analyses. She recalculated damage distributions under multiple assumptions, explicitly documenting how results shifted. The aim was not to prove a point, but to show the stability or fragility of conclusions under different frames. This work was time-consuming and exacting. Mechanical calculators were unforgiving. A single miskeyed digit required restarting a sequence. Verification often took longer than initial calculation. As the analysis deepened, a consensus began to form around a limited but actionable conclusion. While exact damage patterns on lost aircraft could not be known, the absence of damage in certain sections among survivors was unlikely to indicate strength. More plausibly, it indicated that damage in those sections prevented return. This conclusion did not demand sweeping changes. It suggested a rebalancing. Engineering teams translated this insight into modest proposals. Rather than adding armor uniformly or concentrating it on visibly damaged areas, they considered redistributing protection towards sections previously assumed to be less vulnerable. Weight constraints were carefully managed. Changes were incremental. The survivability panel reviewed these proposals with caution. The recommendations were framed as adjustments rather than corrections. Official language emphasized optimization within existing doctrine. Even so, the shift was meaningful. It represented a departure from relying solely on observed damage among survivors as the basis for protection decisions. Institutionally, attribution was diffuse.
The revised recommendations emerged from committee processes, supported by multiple analyses. No single individual was credited. This was consistent with military practice, particularly in technical domains. For the woman, this meant that her role remained largely invisible. Her name did not appear in summary memoranda. Her contribution was embedded in tables and methods rather than in conclusions. The stakes, however, were clear. The revised armor placement strategies were scheduled for implementation in upcoming production runs. Aircraft already in service would not be retrofitted extensively, but new builds would reflect the updated guidance. Field units were informed that changes were being made based on accumulated operational data. The explanation was brief and technical. No mention was made of methodological debates. As spring progressed, missions continued under evolving conditions. Escort coverage improved further. Loss rates fluctuated for multiple reasons, making it difficult to isolate the effect of any single change. Within Wright Field, attention shifted to new analytical challenges. The survivability review was not closed, but it was no longer the primary focus. The woman returned to routine work, though her understanding of its potential consequences had changed. She continued to calculate, verify, and tabulate, aware that small methodological choices could shape decisions far removed from her desk. The institutional response had been cautious, incremental, and largely anonymous. There was no declaration of error or breakthrough. There was only adjustment. The analytical framework had absorbed a challenge without public acknowledgement, and the system moved forward.
By the summer of 1944, the analytical episode that had begun with quiet recalculations at Wright Field had largely faded from immediate attention. The Army Air Forces were focused on sustaining air operations in support of the Normandy landings and subsequent advances across Western Europe. Operational demands accelerated, and priorities shifted toward coordination, logistics, and replacement planning. Aircraft continued to roll off production lines with incremental refinements. Some of those refinements reflected adjustments informed by earlier survivability reviews, though they were not identified as such in public documentation. Armor placement was one of many variables modified within the constraints of weight, range, and performance. No single change was credited with measurable outcomes. Instead, improvements were understood as cumulative. Loss rates fluctuated across the remainder of the war, influenced by escort availability, enemy defenses, weather, and evolving tactics. Analysts continued to collect and summarize data, aware that causation in complex systems resisted simple attribution. Within Wright Field, the woman's role remained formally unchanged. She continued working as a civilian analyst until the end of the war, performing calculations similar in appearance to those she had completed earlier. The context had shifted, but the routines were familiar. Reports arrived, figures were checked, tables were prepared. Her contribution was not marked by promotion or public recognition. The wartime analytical system did not single out individuals for methodological insight unless they held formal authority or authored official reports. Civilian analysts operated within collective processes, their work absorbed into institutional output. After the war, many temporary analytical units were dissolved or reorganized. Civilian staff returned to academic or industrial positions or left technical work entirely. Records were archived. Wartime memoranda were filed under subject headings rather than names. The survivability review became part of a broader historical understanding of how operational research evolved during the conflict. Later analysts and historians would describe it as an example of how statistical reasoning matured under pressure. The emphasis was often placed on the concept rather than on those who applied it quietly within institutional constraints. In retrospect, the significance of the work lay not in dramatic intervention, but in disciplined attention to what data could imply when treated with care. The woman had not altered doctrine single-handedly. She had not issued directives or challenged authority publicly. She applied mathematics with restraint, recognizing that how data was framed mattered as much as the data itself. Her calculator did not reveal truths hidden from others.
It enforced consistency. It made assumptions visible by exposing their consequences. The institutional response reflected the nature of military organizations under wartime conditions. Changes were absorbed gradually, framed as refinements rather than reversals. Credit was distributed broadly, if at all. The system valued continuity and reliability over individual insight. After the war, discussions of bomber survivability entered academic literature and professional military education. Concepts related to survivorship bias were taught explicitly, often illustrated with simplified examples. The historical origin of those examples was sometimes mentioned in general terms, tied to wartime analysis, but rarely connected to specific individuals. The woman's name did not appear in textbooks. Her worksheets did not survive as standalone artifacts. Her legacy existed indirectly, in methods that became standard and assumptions that were eventually questioned more routinely. This was characteristic of much wartime analytical work. Progress occurred through accumulation rather than revelation. It depended on individuals willing to apply technical discipline, even when recognition was unlikely. The story of how one woman with a calculator contributed to improved understanding of aircraft survivability is therefore not a story of invention or heroism in the conventional sense. It is a story of competence exercised within limits and of institutional systems that sometimes adapt quietly when confronted with careful evidence. Her work did not win the air war alone. It informed decisions that, alongside many others, shaped how resources were allocated and risks managed. Its value lay in reducing uncertainty, not in eliminating it. As the war concluded and peacetime priorities returned, the analytical frameworks developed under pressure continued to influence military and civilian research. The lessons learned about data interpretation extended beyond aviation, shaping approaches in fields as diverse as medicine, engineering, and economics. The woman's contribution was part of that broader legacy. It required no monument. It required only acknowledgement that progress often depends on those who notice when correct calculations point toward incomplete conclusions. For those interested in understanding how large systems adapt through quiet, disciplined work rather than dramatic moments, this story offers one example worth remembering.